Hi everyone, I'm Daniel, I'm an illustrator, and in this video we're going to be revisiting the underwater city of Rapture and world of Bioshock. Bioshock was a tremendously influential game since it released in 2007, and in 2 years' time we're going to hit the game's 20th anniversary, which is just insane to think about. Wow, damn. Okay, Wyatt. With that being said, something that has surprised me is how often I talk to people about Bioshock whenever I'm tabling at an art convention. The game has had incredibly strong staying power in the gaming zeitgeist. I think a massive portion of that goes towards the incredible art direction the team at Irrational Games crafted during its development. Back then, the most popular games in the industry were either high fantasy, sci-fi and aliens, or a war shooter of some kind, so Bioshock stood out as unique by comparison. That, coupled with an incredible story, a tense and spooky atmosphere, and engaging world building, led to Bioshock becoming one of the most influential games ever. So, if you've ever wondered why Bioshock has remained so captivating, even though we haven't had a game in 12 years, let's take a look back at the initial design philosophies of creating Rapture, analyze some concept art, and revisit key locations in the game. In the background of this video, I'm also going to be sharing some Bioshock fan art I did with a painting that I call Rapture in Splendor. And as always, there will be mild spoilers for Bioshock in this video. Let's begin. Indeed, and before becoming what it was known today, the look and feel of Bioshock would continue to be refined and changed as the team explored ideas, even being set in vastly different time periods.
When it first started out, it was set in different times. It's gone from everything from modern day to the far future until we eventually, set it back in time somewhat, especially with the architecture.
In an interview with the game's creative director Ken Levine, another early idea explored was the player character being a cult deprogrammer hired by a senator. There was no Rapture, no Andrew Ryan, no Big Daddies or Little Sisters. Of course, this is hard to imagine now with how iconic everything else ended up being. As these ideas continued to evolve, one core philosophy held at Irrational Games was gameplay first, story second. Ken Levine also stated that they sought to make Bioshock within a believable, lived-in world that led to emergent gameplay opportunities. This also helped the team as they continued to refine things based on the player experience, and having those design limitations at the start guided every single decision being made. When examining Irrational's previous games with the System Shock series, it's easy to see the same DNA that was carried over to Bioshock, despite both of them being set in completely different locations. Both games are first person, with the player character gaining access to a variety of weapons to use however they see fit. There's also a main antagonist throughout both games, and both games also feature world building through the use of audio logs. However, differing from System Shock 2 was how the team approached creating Bioshock's actual map and level design. In System Shock 2, which was set aboard a starship, each deck was physically mapped out that the player could explore. This led to a great feeling of immersion as the physical space matched up with the setting. With Bioshock, it was far less feasible to construct an entirely explorable underwater city, but the narrative and atmosphere would make players feel like the setting was far bigger than it actually was. Which then begs the question, why choose underwater in the first place? The team has admitted that rather than there being a huge conceptual reason, it was just because it was one of those ideas that sounded cool, which they expanded on from there.
I don't want to apply some deep and meaningful conversation. I think it was one of those ideas that you just kind of say, and then everybody, that sounds cool, let's try that, let's go for it.
Choosing an underwater setting also helped them build the game in a few key areas. As Irrational Games were a small team back then, setting Bioshock underwater meant they could build the outside city of Rapture without a ton of detailed assets. After all, the underwater atmosphere would occlude things the further players would look from the camera, allowing our imagination to fill the rest. That's right, Wyatt. There was no help coming from outside forces because, after all, Rapture was meant to be a city that was cut off and isolated from the rest of the world. This added tension as the player character was chucked in this hostile city all by themselves. And speaking of the city, perhaps the most crucial moment during production was when Ken Levine and his wife were walking around the Rockefeller Center in New York. The grandiose and larger-than-life feeling in the Rockefeller Center was a huge influence on Bioshock, and this eventually became the look and feel of Rapture. In fact, Rockefeller Center itself contains 14 original Art Deco buildings, all commissioned by the Rockefeller family back in the 1930s. As Levine describes, it's the only part in New York with a singular architectural style. After all, if somebody convinced you to leave your life on land to move towards their underwater utopian city, you'd better hope that it's at least nice. Now, Art Deco itself was a decorative art style that flourished in the 1920s and 30s, and was a post-war movement that focused on optimism, progress, and technology. If you look up pictures of the movement, you're going to notice a lot of repeating patterns, and this is often through stylized representations of things like sun rays and floral patterns. One element we see this being used in Rapture are the vents the little sisters often hide in. The vertical motifs stretch upward into a flower pattern that evokes a feeling of a sunset. Where game creation is concerned, the choice to go for Art Deco also helped production, as the shapes were simple enough that it wasn't too taxing on the game's engine. A lot of the models here were very low poly, which fit in with the aesthetic. Piece by piece and rivet by rivet, Rapture began to take a life on its own. It became bigger, more bombastic, and eventually became very much a character in itself. In this screenshot, we can also see more of the Art Deco influence through the elegant curves, repeating motifs, circular patterns, and chevrons. But a key element I want to bring to your attention is the use of vertical lines. These lines represented a feeling of moving up and would often showcase the height of buildings as a way to symbolize technological advancements. With that in mind, I also find this works at the bottom of the ocean, with the vertical lines now showing quite literal depth as you look above. Now, let's move on for a second and have a look at some of the early concept art that eventually influenced the look and feel of Rapture. This is our first image that we're going to take a look at, and these are all taken from the Breaking the Mold art book that came with the original Bioshock many years ago. But I find that it's really interesting having a look at this image in particular because it doesn't really look like the Rapture that we know. We've got these kind of circular structures over here. They're not really vertical, but you can see that there's still the idea of having bridges between different buildings, and especially a lot of the man-made yellow lights that comes from inside the actual city itself. Something to note is that we've also got these volcano structures over here. This is also explained in the actual game in the level, I think it's called Hephaestus, where it shows that all of the volcanic activity is actually the thing that provides a lot of warmth and makes the actual area livable for the citizens of Rapture. But you can see the actual tone and mood itself is very moody. It's very dark. It's not at all like what we got in the final game. The mood and feel, of course, in Rapture in the games is a lot brighter, and something that's really distinct about the first Bioshock is you have that sickly green glow coming from the ocean. When you look outside the windows in Rapture, you'll notice that you can see the actual light source of the sun, which I kind of feel like gives a different sense of feeling in the actual water when you look outside. The second image that we look at over here is just another section of Rapture, but we can start to see, of course, that we have a lot of the water leaking in through the roofs from the top. It was actually important, and this was an important design element that the team over at Irrational Games made, just because they wanted to continuously remind the player that they were in fact underwater. Some of the early design prototypes of Rapture sort of strayed a little bit away from that underwater setting, and it started to feel, in their words, a little bit more like System Shock, where it feels like a spaceship rather than in this actual city that's under the ocean. So you're definitely going to notice a lot of the leaks coming in here, which also goes to reinforce the fact that Rapture has fallen. It's no longer at the height of its powers anymore, and it's this place that's starting to fall apart and be reclaimed by the ocean that it was so callously trying to keep out. Here are a couple of other sections here that we're looking at. This one is quite grim. We've got a couple of bodies just in the tank over here. Who knows how they got outside? Perhaps this is another submerged section of Rapture, but we're starting to get more of a feel of the lighting that's coming from ahead. A lot of the colors within Bioshock contrasts between that sickly green glow that I mentioned earlier from the ocean and the warmer tones coming from the light sources inside of Rapture. You often see things with lights up above or with fire or things like that, and it's just a good way to indicate to the player where they should be going. Of course, you want to avoid the blue sections as much as possible. Here's a section that looks very familiar to me. I believe this is Fontaine's Fishery that occurs right at the start of the game. So you'll get the sense that it really feels like kind of like a dock area, except the irony is, again, you are underwater, you're not actually above water. But we get the sense of a lot more different colored lights and ads that's going on in this area over here. There's also a lot of wood sections that's going across, so a lot of Art Deco itself was only just a couple of different materials, mostly concrete and metals and things like that. So that wood really helps to sell the feeling of it being more organic and natural. This is also something we're going to talk about later on when we examine the level from Arcadia, with a lot of that wood motif that's happening. But you can see here that, of course, once again, we are reminded about water. And this piece of concept art here, which looks like some kind of captain's brig perhaps, or it almost looks like the end of a cruise liner. But you'll see that we can really feel the Art Deco motif sort of going around in this even just little piece of concept art. Most of the ornate patterns that you see in Art Deco here with the geometric shapes can be found over this catwalk. They can also be found in circular motifs and horizontals over on the actual floor panels themselves. But we also see that even the steps going up over here, they're not just normal 90-degree steps. They're very purposely designed to be those half ellipses that we see, and this is something that's repeated throughout a lot of Bioshock. So it's cool to see it exist in small functional ways over here, but we also see it in archways and on the side of buildings and even sorts of different iconographies and things like that as well. Even just looking at the actual art here, we can actually see that the artist has drawn through on the other side, just to make sure that perspective is all good. But we get a sense of the actual materials being used, even though this entire concept art is in black and white. What I find really cool is that obviously you can kind of interpret, maybe this would be some sort of mixture of polished wood and metal, and then we're going to have a lot of brass sections over here. A lot of the rivets kind of do that heavy lifting and imply what sort of material it is without us seeing it. But even the window over here, we can see that there's a whole bunch of rivets. So once again, going back into the theme of just sort of underwater vessels in a submarine, for instance, these are the kinds of things that you're going to see just because of the immense pressure of the world outside. Obviously, we have to have certain precautions in place. So these all subconsciously link to you, the player, of everything that's going on in the actual world and design of Rapture. Now, here are a couple of shop fronts that we've got concept art for. It looks like it's a place called Sonia's Fine Modern Wardrobe, which I don't remember if it's in the actual game or not, so if it is, just let me know in the comments down below. But once again, we get to see Art Deco sort of full on display. You'll notice that we have, starting over here with this column, those vertical lines going up, but then it sort of fans out over here with these repeating sort of rectangular structures. And that very much feels like Art Deco as it repeats the shapes multiple times, kind of adding to the sense of grandioseness, like this big pillar over here supporting this the ceiling. But we also see that, of course, the actual fashion itself, very much Art Deco. Now, the original Bioshock, I believe, is set in 1960, but Rapture itself had fallen a year prior. So we still get to see sort of the fashion influence of Art Deco through this sort of corset over here. Again, sort of the simple curved lines and things of that nature as well. But again, something that's very, very interesting is that that design element is repeated in things like trash cans. So instead of, again, just like a normal trash can that you would see in like modern society, which may just be like an office trash can, something like this with a bunch of, you know, the grid-wired patterns on it. Of course, it's going to be a little bit extra, a little bit different. So very curved opening over here, the way that it sort of goes down, and even the lip on the top of the actual trash can itself. These are all very much intentional design decisions that the artists at Irrational Games strove for to make you really feel like you were in a place that was completely Art Deco. And we also have a light over here, which looks very interesting. Now, if you had to guess, what does this make you think of? Because for me, it makes me think of something like a seahorse or a shell. Again, obviously reinforcing that ocean iconography, which is actually quite cool. Of course, a lot of exploration is going on, and not everything you see in the concept art makes it into the final game, but it all kind of reinforces that central theme. Finally, one of the last pieces that I want to take a look at is this one over here, which looks to be the home of a Rapture citizen. You can see that there's a giant trophy wall over here, so lots of different types of fish that you can expect at the bottom of the ocean, even a squid over here. But just notice all of the design of all the furniture that's going on. So again, we've got a ship in a bottle, more of a very sort of, looks to me like a diving suit trash can / mail device over here as well. But the actual decor is very much fitting in line with that 1930s or 40s kind of theme here. Something you'll notice too, well, it looks like there's a spear gun over here first of all, so that's how we know that this person got all these trophies, is that they probably went out into the water of Rapture and didn't explode in a giant heap under that immense pressure and found their fish. But you'll notice too, just from a technical point of view, the perspective in this image doesn't really match up with everything that's going on. So for example, The bottom of the couch here is flat, where we can actually see more of an angle of the bookshelf over here. So this is going to a different horizon line. The horizon line in the chair is probably somewhere here, whereas for this bookshelf, it's probably like around about there-ish. You'll notice that a lot of the concept art that we've seen together so far has been very, very rough and not at all polished as stuff you might see on ArtStation. And I think at this point, the team probably wasn't thinking about things like that. They probably didn't care about all of this different stuff and nailing the look just right away. They were probably aiming for speed and efficiency, which is why you see a lot of mistakes like this. It's not that they're not skilled, that they can't do it. It's just that in the essence of time, it's probably just rapid fire, trying to get as many of these out as possible and focusing more on the colors and mood. So I find it interesting now looking back at some of these older pieces here, how rough the actual concept art was versus things that you might see in a AAA production these days. But still, it shows that the execution of the idea lies much more in the function of the space and the colors used than any sort of pretty paintings, for instance. So that's just something that I want you to keep in mind. Let's move on now and see how Rapture ended up looking in the final game by revisiting a few key locations. We're going to do these rapid fire style, analyzing how they impacted gameplay and reinforced the game's atmosphere. If I do miss any key locations that you wanted to have a look at, leave them down in the comments below and let's discuss it further. In the famous opening of Bioshock, we're pitched by Andrew Ryan inside a bathysphere about this grand idea he had about creating the city at the bottom of the ocean. Eventually, we're introduced to Rapture with looming buildings, ads, and all kinds of marine life everywhere for scale. There's nothing quite like seeing a whale next to a building for our brains to go, yep, we're not in Kansas anymore. We can see the Art Deco influences immediately on things like the patterns on the sides of buildings. The Finley sign also reminds me of the Radio City Music Hall sign in New York, which is a nice touch. It's fairly simple, there's multi-layered lines on top, and it all adds to the grandiose feeling of this section. This is a great game introduction because the bathysphere gives us a chance to see Rapture all at once. After this, we're mostly in interiors for the rest of the game. We're able to take a good look at the journey we're about to embark on, and I think this is such a clever way of immersing us into the world, quite literally. Contrasting to the glamour and spectacle of the opening, we're immediately thrown into the welcome section, which is a little different. I'm sure you probably felt this too, but I was so scared when those doors opened that I didn't even want to step out. It's clear now that we can see that Rapture is in complete disarray. Through various signs on the floor, we also noticed that there was a protest and some kind of civil unrest in the supposed Grand Utopia. Since this takes place right after Ryan's pitch and reason for building the city, we obviously see that his attempt at creating a utopia failed horribly. The lighting here is extremely dark, which definitely contrasts with our expectations. It's through all of these tiny details and decisions that make irrational games such beasts when it comes to environmental storytelling. It's not necessarily a case of show don't tell, but instead a mixture of the two. Some things are exposited to us through audio logs and character interactions, and others are very much only pieced together through the environment. In what is probably the most memorable area of Bioshock, we have Fort Frolic, which is the entertainment/commercial area of Rapture. I find that this area stands out from the rest of Rapture because it's not necessarily Andrew Ryan pulling the strings, but instead crazed artist Sander Cohen. This area showcases the full power of Art Deco. Lavish materials, ornate patterns, and romantic purple lighting, all inviting people in. Something, of course, in this area I've noticed is that there's a lot more colors going on, more signage, and more ads. You get the feeling that only the rich and powerful would visit this area, and folks that wanted a more leisurely lifestyle. After all, it is called Fort Frolic for a reason. Of course, in Bioshock fashion, this contrasts with the twisted experiments that Sander Cohen was running to put on his art show. A fun detail is that there's an area called Fleet Hall, which also harkens back to Radio City Music Hall. You can even see a tagline that reads Andrew Ryan presents The Coquettes, which is a funny homage to the Rockettes, who famously performed at Radio City Music Hall. Arcadia is the only place in Rapture where grass and trees exist, and this feels extremely different because of it. For as radical as this area is, Irrational explains its existence through the plants providing the oxygen Rapture needed to survive. But this idea may not seem that radical because it was inspired by real life. One of the wishes of businessman J.D. Rockefeller was to have parks on top of every setback in Rockefeller Center when it was being built, which was in itself quite a feat that was eventually achieved. Arcadia feels like an homage to that, because even in Rapture, they have somehow found a way to engineer plant life to grow at the bottom of the ocean despite all odds. Where Art Deco is concerned, we see the same elegant curves being used on doors and archways, which ties everything together. Even due to Arcadia's visual difference from the rest of Rapture, it still feels like it belongs to the city due to all of the Art Deco motifs being repeated here. The colors, like Fort Frolic, are extremely vibrant but in a natural way. Although we see wood flooring in other sections of the game, here it feels much more fitting and natural to have a mixture of browns and greens coalescing. We also see materials like exposed cobblestone being used, and while concrete was a staple of Art Deco, it's being repurposed here to fit the theme of the level. As a result, Arcadia feels a lot warmer and less hostile. Though the same can't be said for the Houdini Splicer. Screw that guy. The last area I want to take a look at is Olympus Heights, which is a more residential area of Rapture. We see a bunch of Atlas posters here, which gives more of a feeling of the working class citizens and not the wealthy or elite. I think it was intentional to show this area much later in the game, because at first we're drawn by the spectacle and riches of Rapture, only to realize that class divide does exist even in the quote-unquote utopia. The materials being used here are more crude and less refined. While they still fit within Art Deco, there's a lot more concrete and we see fewer windows looking out into the ocean. This makes it feel more isolated and separate from the rest of the city. I find that the area also feels like a kind of subway station. There are long horizontal stretches and less emphasis on verticality. Olympus Heights is actually one of my favorite sections in the game because it itself feels contained from the rest of Rapture, and like a place most people would go out of their way to visit. In the years following Bioshock's release, we would go on to revisit Rapture a couple more times in Bioshock 2, at the end of Bioshock Infinite, and of course in the DLC's Burial at Sea. For the most part, Rapture remains the same in design. We still have Art Deco, we still have water reclaiming the city, and a creepy, intense atmosphere. However, there are a couple of key differences I want to illustrate. In Bioshock 2, which is set 10 years after the first game, Rapture feels even more decayed. There's a lot more rust and barnacles growing everywhere. The leaks have completely submerged some sections of the map, and the colors themselves are a lot more muted and blue. This is also the only game that we get to see Rapture outside, due to us playing as a Big Daddy, and it gives a unique view into the city in areas that we wouldn't be able to see. The buildings themselves are falling apart and broken, and it kind of looks like a post-apocalypse. One of the main things I've noticed is that instead of the sickly green glow from the ocean in the first game, the lighting itself in Bioshock 2 feels far more oppressive and dark. You can feel more of the weight of the ocean because we can no longer see a clear light source from above, which adds to a feeling of depth. In contrast, Burial at Sea answers the question of what Rapture would look like during its height, and I loved exploring this entire section during my first playthrough. We really get to see the full contrast of colors on display. The cool blue tones from the ocean outside, contrasting heavily with the much warmer, inviting colors of the interiors. There are a lot more red and ivory tones on display here, which feeds into the themes of greed, glamour, and luxury. Like Bioshock 2, the outside ocean feels much more dark and oppressive, and I actually think it's because the DLC takes place during night, but it also makes Rapture feel like it's on the bottom of the abyss. Though I will mention it's kind of a shame the entire DLC didn't last like this, because shortly after this section, we go into a forgotten area of Rapture and it immediately feels like the first two games. Still, we get to see this awesome view of Rapture from Fontaine's department store. It's so creepy and far away, it's kind of like an isolation sandwich. In Rapture, you're already feeling isolated and away from the rest of the world, and in Fontaine's department store, you feel even more isolated from Rapture. The vast distance that separates you from the closest sense of civilization is really illustrated through this ravine and the scale of the lights. So now that we're nearing 20 years after the release of Bioshock, it's quite easy to see why the game has stayed in our public minds for so long. The extremely strong art direction from Irrational Games all those years ago proved what having a clear idea and focus can do. As the saying goes, Rome wasn't built in a day, and neither was Rapture. It started off with a simple premise of a game being set underwater, and once that was figured out, the questions of who would build something like this, who are the people that would oppose him, and more importantly, who we were, all fell into place. To this day, I find myself thinking back on that initial early Bioshock trailer that came with Xbox 360s. I watched that a whole bunch when I was much younger, and the game scared me so much, I had no idea it'd be such a big influence on me today. When I was also studying game design in uni, one of my first assignments was to create this character wearing armor, and of course I picked the Big Daddy, which you can see over here. If it wasn't for my experience playing Bioshock at the end of high school, I genuinely think I wouldn't have signed up to study art in the first place. And because of that, it holds a special place in my heart. And also on my wrists. Now, I haven't gone too in-depth about my painting process during this video, but all I can say is that I tried to incorporate everything we discussed. When I was doing my initial color sketches, I tried a palette that was more Bioshock 1, another that was more Burial at Sea, and eventually settled on one in between. I wanted Rapture to feel big and grand like it was in Burial at Sea, and also showcase all of the Art Deco influences through the use of vertical lines and clean shapes. For any artists out there, I also made a city builder pack on my Gumroad, which really helped to speed up the process. It's basically just a collection of custom shapes such as windows and different building details and things like that, which can help you to speed up your painting process. It's especially useful if you're inspired by New York kind of architecture and things like that as well. If you're also interested in supporting the channel, then stay tuned for future videos and posts because I have a very exciting announcement to make.
Oh my God!
So enough of me yapping, I'd like to know, what do you think about the Bioshock games? Do you think that Rapture is a lot more memorable than Columbia, for instance? And why do you think that Bioshock has had such incredible staying power in the gaming consciousness? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments down below. As always, thank you so much for watching everyone, and until next time, take care.